I'm speaking on behalf of Executive Director Dr. Carol Marquis. I speak to present some of EDCOM's findings on the three-term school calendar that is being proposed for implementation for school year 2026 to 2027. Next slide. So basically, as we had discussed during the previous meeting, the goal of the three-term calendar is really to preserve instructional time. Also, its goal is also to ensure that we are able to provide specific blocks for certain activities that are both instructional, administrative, and also for the extracurricular activities as needed for the schools to be undertaken. Next slide. So we presented here a very quick graphic representation of the three blocks. The opening block, which is set for 4 days, the instructional block, which is targeted for 55 days, and the end of term block with a minimum of 8 days. So this is pursuant to Department Order number 9 series of 2026. But we have noted in this presentation, if you could look at it, that there is a perennial peak typhoon season which takes place from September to November, which does result in cancellation of classes. And at the same time also, there's also been observed some heat indexes, peak incidences taking place in March and April, which does lead to cancellation of classes in some parts of the country. Next slide. So we decided to emphasize this because based on EDCOM's study from for this particular school year, there's an average of 11 days of disruption from the period of September to November. And with that, there's also a compression in terms of the number of school days that will be covered. So we also want to take note that that's based on what we've been able to find, that there's an average number of 11 days of disruption throughout the country for particularly hitting term 2 of the intended rollout. Next slide. So this leads some points that we'd want to very briefly touch on. So while Department Order number 9 series of 2026 does allocate intended instructional days required by law for 201 days, we'll present some very quick slides later on about moving forward. This may actually be reduced from 201 days to an average of less than 180 days or 179 days. Also, protection of term 2 must be given consideration, and recovery of school days of not just the school days themselves, but the collective learning of the students during that time must also be considered. We also submit that alternative delivery modes for disaster-prone areas in schools must also be raised, considering that in the previous school year, 16 of 18 regions exceeded 5 lost days, particularly in term 2. And with that, we also submit that the ARAL program participants further transition from existing ARAL program modules and the corresponding termination for their continued participation or graduation should also be allocated or considered in the time. And finally, the end of term blocks raise the question of prioritization as to should certain days be lost during these times, for instance, like mentioned, from March and April for the end of term. What will be prioritized? Will it be the ARAL program, the completion of school forms, activities, or inset? Next slide. So as mentioned earlier, there is the fact that EDCOM had found that using an average of determination of average regional maximal days lost, 201-day calendar could lose an average of 22 school days. For instance, we point out that regions 5 and 6 lost on 28 to 29 school days due to the disruption brought about by Panukalang. So in particular, the typhoon season itself is also brought into question, considering that 11 days lost in the second term result in just 55 days of instruction. And as mentioned, some regions could lose up to an average of 20 days as well. Next slide. Also, EDCOM had been advocating for the rationalization or the optimization of school forms, which based on our studies and discussions with teachers on the ground, has been a constant source of dissonance in terms of their function of really providing instruction for students. So when we conducted a study in 2024, it found that in addition to the amount of time that was spent for instruction, which is 23.4, an average of 17.8 hours on ancillary work and 2.7 hours on informal and admin work are undertaken by our teachers. And so while we do acknowledge that DEP had taken major steps in terms of rationalizing the number of forms from 174 to 75, that is still a substantial amount of time to cover. Next slide. So we submit that the question must be raised that are the 75 forms that are finally required actually manageable within the 4-day opening and 5-day end of term block without bleeding or leading into instructional time. So we also asked that DepEd could provide some more guidance on prioritization for the timetable and urgency of these forms, as well as the goal of digitalizing these forms in order to minimize the amount of time that our teachers would spend on them. And finally, next slide, we submit that ARAL schedule must also be considered within the instructional blocks, but only, so based on the fact that ARAL itself is only within these blocks, the assessments for these participants to graduate or exit the ARAL program, the scale of time given to ARAL learners to show scaled improvement, and the proof of concept for a 5-day end-of-term ARAL intervention, we submit should also be considered and presented by them. And so with that, our final slide for this presentation is we have some quick clarification. Next slide, please. Some quick clarificatory questions for DepEd that we hope could be raised. Next slide. Next. Okay, sorry. So with that, some clarificatory questions would be, while DepEd now provides functional literacy training for the first 30 days of grade 1, what about the other grade levels that have identified by the end of school year that are still struggling with literacy? During the ARAL program presentation, we'll be presenting some of that later as well. Finally, reconciliation between the 20-day period during summer for ARAL and under Department O number 9, how will that 5-day period be utilized? Who attends and for what purpose? That has to be presented in a more, we submit in a more organized and more definitive manner. Teacher workload and fatigue must also be raised if ARAL is conducted in class, particularly key learning stages 3 and 4, longer class days are required. So we have to factor in the amount of fatigue and amount of ability of our teachers to really function optimally within these times. And just to raise that earlier question, given the 201 school day calendar, in order to meet it, given the average days of disruption, how will we manage the 5-day alternative delivery mode instruction, particularly in disaster-prone areas wherein this disruptions will most likely take place? And finally, we do submit that there has to be some clarity with regard to prioritization of activities, particularly during the end-of-term block, given the category of activities which takes precedence. So with that, thank you very much, Mr. Chair.